Today, we're asking a really critical question. When federal immigration enforcement hits an unprecedented, just a record high, why do certain local sanctuary policies continue to protect individuals charged with violent, even fatal crimes? We're diving into a conflict where state-level legal protections are colliding directly with these surging federal removal efforts. And we really have to start with the immediate chilling flashpoint that defines this whole debate. It originates in New York, December 2025. This is the tragic homicide of a cab driver, Aurelio Zhunio-Orbez, who was allegedly strangled over a fare dispute in Brewster, New York. The suspect, Santos Paulino Vasquez-Ramirez, is a criminal illegal alien from Guatemala. And what elevates this, from a local tragedy to a national policy crisis is his history. He entered the country illegally back in 2013 and critically had a final legally binding order of removal issued by an immigration judge. That was on January 22nd, 2016. And despite that order, he was subsequently released into the community. So when this horrific crime happened, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, they responded immediately. IC lodged a detainer, and an assistant secretary declared in a stark statement, and I'm quoting here, Santos Vasquez-Ramirez should never have been in our country in the first place and provided the opportunity to gruesomely take the life of Aurelio Zhunio-Orbez. Okay. The quote ends, open border policies have deadly consequences. So this tragedy, it just exposes a dangerous fracture. On one side, you have federal agencies using massive resources for enforcement, and on the other, you have local policies that are actively preventing them from taking custody of the very people they are ordered to remove.
And that's our mission in this deep dive. We need to synthesize the data that really frames this conflict. We're going to look at two major connected themes. First, we have to establish the accelerating scale of this 2025 federal enforcement campaign. It demonstrates a massive historic commitment to interior operations. And second, we will dissect the precise, very technical legal friction that these local sanctuary laws create. We'll use the judicial warrant standard as our anchor point for that. And this ultimately leads us to a fundamental policy choice. Do you prioritize immediate accountability, or do you prioritize long-term community trust?
Okay, let's unpack this, and let's start with, the sheer volume of enforcement that's happening right now. The federal commitment to moving people inside the country and removing them, it's just skyrocketed.
The commitment is undeniable, and the numbers are. They're truly historic. If you look at the data from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement from ICE on their flights from January through September of 2025, they recorded a total of 9,192 immigration enforcement flights.
9,000 flights. In just 9 months. That isn't just a big number. It reflects an overwhelming acceleration compared to the year before.
Absolutely. This activity represents a 61% increase compared to the same period in 2024. But the acceleration within 2025 itself is really the key. The year started with, around 534 flights in January? But by September, it had peaked at a record high of 1,464 flights in that month alone.
Wow.
Yeah. That meant, on average, 49 enforcement flights were taking off every single day of September.
Every single day. And when we talk about these enforcement flights, it's easy to assume they're all, deportation flights. But the majority of these are actually domestic transfers, right? So-called shuffle flights.
Correct. And this is where clarity really matters. The majority were 5,478 domestic transfer flights. We call them shuffle flights. These move individuals already in custody between U.S. detention centers, processing hubs, and staging facilities before they're ever removed. This 53% increase in shuffle flights shows that the biggest operational challenge isn't just the final removal. It's the massive logistical problem of moving and housing a surging population within the interior enforcement system itself.
So if the federal government is trying to speed up the process, they have to speed up the logistics first.
Precisely. And in addition to those shuffles, they conducted 1,564 deportation or removal flights. The operational shift is dramatic here, too. The scope expanded to a record 48 destination countries in September, which means they are routing flights to places they rarely went before, including unprecedented numbers to sub-Saharan Africa and Asia.
And the sources highlight the expense and complexity of this effort. They even mention the use of military planes.
Yes. They utilized U.S. military aircraft, primarily C-17 cargo planes, for some of these removal ops. That signals a national priority shift. And what's more, the specialized high-risk charters, the flights dealing with particularly difficult or, dangerous removals, they cost anywhere from about $6,900 up to almost $27,000 per flight hour. Per hour. per hour, which far exceeds the average cost of routine removal. So this isn't cheap routine paperwork. This is a rapid, large-scale, and very expensive operational commitment. It's targeting the interior population for removal.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This is where we connect that massive federal operation to the local policies. These high numbers of removals, they require cooperation. Yet local sanctuary policies, like the ones in New York, are designed to do the exact opposite. They prevent federal authorities from taking custody of certain individuals, even those ICE is actively looking to remove.
Yep. The friction point is highly technical. It's all centered on the judicial warrant standard required by New York law. And this is specifically defined by the State Attorney General's guidance for local law enforcement agencies, or LEAs.
Okay, walk us through that distinction clearly, because this seems to be the legal barrier that allows people with removal orders to just walk free.
It is. Under New York law, a local police or correctional agency can only detain someone for immigration purposes if federal authorities present a warrant that meets two criteria. First, it has to be issued by an Article III federal judge or a federal magistrate judge, so a formal member of the judicial branch. And second, it must be based on a finding of probable cause related to a crime or an offense. This is the Fourth Amendment standard for an arrest.
But unauthorized presence in the United States is generally treated as a civil violation.
Yeah.
Right? Not a criminal one.
That is the crucial distinction. That's the whole ballgame. The New York guidance explicitly states that LEAs should not honor typical civil immigration warrants or administrative warrants, like the forms ICE issues, the I-200 or I-205 forms. Why? Because those documents are signed solely by an immigration official that's an executive branch employee, not a judge. Therefore, the local jurisdiction argues that these administrative warrants do not meet the probable cause standard required under New York law to legally detain an individual past their scheduled release date for a local crime.
So it's like ICE is essentially asking the local police or jail to enforce what amounts to a civil ticket. But the local police are saying, look, we can only legally hold someone past their sentence if we have an actual arrest warrant signed by a judge for an actual crime.
That is an excellent analogy, yes. The policy essentially prioritizes protection against unlawful detention, which is a state interpretation of Fourth Amendment rights, over the federal government's desire for immediate immigration enforcement. This is why you see these political movements trying to reverse it. We know about the New York City Council Introduction 945, for instance. It's seeking to repeal the laws that restrict the police, correction, and probation department's cooperation with ICE.
And despite all those limitations, did any cooperation happen at all?
The data really shows how steep that legal hill is. The NYC Department of Correction reported lodging 595 civil immigration detainers in fiscal year 2025. Yet, precisely 0 individuals were held past their release time because of that detainer.
0.
0. Only 19 individuals were transferred to federal custody, which means the overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
Almost all of those 595 detainers were not honored because of this legal barrier.
And this brings us right back to the immediate tragic consequence cited by DHS, that case in Brewster, New York. When the system follows that non-cooperation strategy, the absolute worst-case scenario can become a reality.
This is where the debate moves from, legal theory to the human cost. The case of Santos Paulino Vasquez-Ramirez, charged with the gruesome homicide and robbery of Aurelio Zhunio-Orbez, is the direct example federal authorities point to when they talk about policy failure.
Let's just reiterate the facts around the suspect because they're so important.
Okay. Vasquez-Ramirez, a Guatemalan national, entered illegally in 2013. He received a final order of removal from a judge in 2016. He was, by law, deemed removable. He was supposed to be out of the country years ago, but he remained in the community, allegedly committing this crime that led to the death of Mr. Zhunio-Orbez, whose body was found floating in the Croton Falls Reservoir.
And the DHS statement after that was so clear in connecting the tragedy directly to these policies. They said, Santos Vasquez-Ramirez should have never been in our country in the first place. Open border policies have deadly consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a powerful political interpretation of the tragedy, which frames this human cost as a direct consequence of policy failure. We report on that interpretation now as it's key to the source material, but we have to hold that against some really complex data that suggests a different overall picture.
Exactly. And it raises a really important question. When an individual has already been determined by a judge to be legally removable and is then subsequently charged with a violent crime, doesn't that outweigh the general policy goal of improving community trust?
That is the precise philosophical trade-off. While this immediate high-profile case argues for maximum enforcement and zero tolerance, we have to pivot now to the broader academic data around sanctuary policies, Because those data points tell a really complicated and, frankly, a counterintuitive story.
The data is far less intuitive than the headlines might suggest. A 2022 academic study analyzed county-level sanctuary policies adopted in a previous wave, around 2014. And what they found was, well, a surprising association. Counties that adopted sanctuary policies experienced a statistical decrease of 17.9 violent crimes per 100,000 residents per year.
A decrease.
Oh.
A decrease in violent crime. That sounds like it flies directly in the face of the New York tragedy.
It does. It creates a stark contrast. The academic research suggests this reduction was driven primarily by decreases in aggravated assaults. The theory here is that when local law enforcement is divorced from federal immigration enforcement, immigrant communities feel safer reporting crimes, things like domestic violence or assault. They report them without fearing deportation. So that increased trust leads to more effective policing and, overall, lower violence rates.
And the study actually quantified the economic benefit of this reduction in violence.
They did. Based on their models, the study calculated that these sanctuary policies, across the 88 counties they focused on, translated into a total avoided cost of approximately $101 million per year in violent crime costs. That's the statistical benefit of that community trust.
But they didn't stop there. The study also calculated the cost of the federal policy of maximum cooperation, the detainer system.
And that is perhaps the most shocking number. Based on the same model, the study calculated that federal ICE detainer policies, the system that lets local jurisdictions hold people for IC, actually increase local crime costs by an estimated $3.28 billion per year across all non-sanctuary counties. And what's more, they estimated the statistical cost of just one immigrant being removed through the detainer process to be $182,000.
$182,000 in increased crime costs.
Exactly.
Let's just pause on that figure for a second. It's hard to wrap your head around. How does removing one person statistically cost the community $182,000?
It's an abstract calculation, I know, but it represents the calculated societal cost of reduced trust. The study argues that every time a community member sees someone picked up by ICE with local police help, trust erodes. That reduction in trust means fewer crimes get reported in the future, which ultimately leads to an increase in overall crime. So that $182,000 is the calculated statistical price of that specific type of enforcement.
So what we have is this profound conflict. On one side, the tragic, immediate consequence, the undeniable human cost of a criminal alien released into a sanctuary environment who allegedly took an innocent life. And that's backed by federal agencies demanding immediate enforcement. But on the other side, we have this macroeconomic and social science data suggesting that statistically, these policies might surprisingly lead to lower violence rates overall. They do that by prioritizing community trust, and they assign a multi-billion-dollar cost to the enforcement-first model.
What's so fascinating here is that the debate stops being about policy mechanics and it becomes a philosophical choice. Which metric does a local justice system prioritize? Is it the immediate emotional accountability demanded by a high-profile tragedy, or is it the abstract, long-term statistical benefit of improved community relations? The debate really pits community perception against immediate accountability.
We've navigated a landscape defined by soaring federal enforcement flights, over 9,000 in just 9 months, and this fierce local resistance rooted in legal distinctions between civil and criminal violations. We've seen the immediate deadly consequence of a legally removable criminal alien being released in New York, set against academic data suggesting these local policies might, unexpectedly, lead to overall lower violence rates by fostering trust.
And this raises an important question for you to consider. As the federal government commits these massive resources to its deportation campaign, should local jurisdictions prioritize collaboration with federal agencies to immediately remove individuals who have received final removal orders, especially those with criminal histories? Or is the calculated long-term $3.28 billion annual cost of reduced community trust just too high a price to pay for that cooperation? The data forces you to weigh the abstract cost of a policy against the undeniable cost of life when a system fails to enforce final removal orders. You have to decide which cost your community can bear.
Keep exploring the data. That's our deep dive for today.